fair warning, we're going to be nerding out quite a bit in today's cast. Now, as many of you know, Fi is where I've been putting a lot of my mental energy around Uprising. In addition to exploring Fi's two lines of play, Rupture and Full Draconic, and which one seems better for my personal playstyle, I've really been trying to dial in the right ratios for his builds. What's the right ratio for each of his lines? How many blues does he need? How many Rupture cards? How many Firestarters? And so on. So today I wanted to run down where I'm at right now, share a bit of my logic on what I'm using, both from a pure math standpoint and from a more practical standpoint. Because out of the gate, I was leaning very heavily towards the Kodachi Rupture line as it seemed to promise more consistency. But after sitting down and doing the math, I'm starting to come around to the advantages of Fi's Draconic-focused line. A huge shout out to our channel members for supporting what we do here. If you want to get involved with the channel and the Dice Commando community, please consider joining as a channel member. Remember, these videos are only possible with your support. You can show that support with a like, a subscribe, and by leaving us a comment and sharing your feedback. Community first, and go Commando. Hey there, Flesh and Blood folks, and welcome back to Dice Commando and Go Again. Andrew with you here, as always, and today I'm bracing my inner mathlete, but then also turning right around and telling that same guy that he needs to be a little more realistic with how the game actually works. Now, before we get started, I want to take this opportunity to give a huge shout out to two of our Dice Commando community members who have recently welcomed a new member of their family. To SS Jedi, congratulations on the recent arrival and newest addition to your clan. And to Oates, a special congrats for your first child, and we're ecstatic that little Freya is doing well. We're really happy for you both, taking the next step in your lives. Congratulations. And I guess we'll see you guys back gaming with us in about 14 months. So we are also sponsored here by our friends over at FabDB. You guys know them, you guys love them. Everything from collection management to deck building, deck scouting, everything you need over there. Thank you to our friends over at FabDB for doing what they do for the community, staying on top of it, and sponsoring us here as well. So yeah, what I wanted to do today was go through Fi by the numbers, and yeah, we're gonna nerd out a little bit. Now, to be fair, I'm not gonna go through all of the math that I've been using in terms of the statistics and stuff. Just gonna ballpark it, and you know, just for the other math nerds out there, a lot of the stuff I'll be showing is kind of truncated, right? Because you know, everybody doesn't need everything; they just kind of want the conclusions for the most part, right? So what this comes down to me, right, is just a reminder of Fi's two lines of play, right? He has the Rupture line, which essentially, for the most part, we're saying, okay, you'd Kodachi, something else, and filler card, whatever you want to call it. And then you're going to finish with a Rupture card or a big hitter or something like that, something with an on-hit effect that is going to let you punch through some damage and then really make them make a decision on what they want to do, right? Whether it be Kodachi, usually you want it to be a run. It could be an Erase Face or a Command and Conquer. It could be something like that as well as your Ruptures. But probably you're going to want to stick with a 1 so that you can run it off blue pitch and then still have cards in your hand to block on your own or do something. On the other hand, we have the Fi Don't Care, the Phoenix line, right? The full-on Draconic line, which, can do some pretty crazy things, but at least on the surface promises to not be quite as consistent. And when I say on the surface, I do mean on the surface, because actually, as I've been playing around with it, it's not too shabby. So let's talk first about, before we go into the actual math and conclusions and stuff, right? Let's talk first about why these guys need their ratios to be as tight, why these lines need the ratios to be as tight. So the class of cards that I'm calling the Firestarters, I'm showing many of those up here, right? Stuff like Brand the Cinder, that I put the two on top that I like the most. Brand with Cinderclaw is fantastic because it can actually turn a Kodachi, right? It doesn't say attack action, it says attack. It can actually turn a Kodachi into a Draconic, which does not suck. You have Rising Resentment, which really basically saves you a resource if they don't block it. You have Spreading Flames, which obviously is, the Majestic, I don't need to talk more about that, but you have the others in there. Some of them are zeros, right? The Ronin Renegade. Every time I see Goblin Renegade, I think that's an old Magic card, right? But you have Ronin Renegade in there, which not only is it Firestarter, but it's just a 0/3. Like, you can still play it as a mid-chain. Then you have the others. Dustrunner Outlaw is probably the worst of those, but they get the job done. Now, why these guys are important is, first, they start your chain, right? They are non-dependent go again, right? That's important. And not only do they do something, but they give you the non-dependent go again to start your chain, right? They're starting your fire. That's why I've called them that. And remember why that's important is you have cards like Inflame and Blaze Headlong that depend, and there's other cards out there as well that do this, but they depend on a red having been played, right? So these guys, right, Inflame, Blaze Headlong, they are your mid chains to continue to put on pressure if the red has been played. So in many cases, you want your Firestarter to be a red card. It doesn't have to be, but in many cases, you want them to be. Then you also have cards that are a little more forgiving, like Lava Vein Loyalty, which in of itself just depends on there being other Draconic links out there. But again, if you can't open with this, because then it's just a 0 for 3, right? To have the go again, it can't be an opener, right? So that's why I'm focusing in on the need to have a Firestarter, especially for, well, not really for the Rupture line, but for the Draconic line, you almost certainly need to have a Firestarter. For something like the Kodachi line, you can really open up almost like a hybrid build, especially with something like Cinderclaw, where you can count. Because remember, your Draconic's chain links for many of your cards don't depend on them being consecutive Draconic chain links. You just have to own them, right? So a Cinderclaw into a Kodachi, into a Draconic Kodachi, into a non-Draconic Kodachi, but then you have another Draconic after that, you could actually still trigger Spider's ability and bring back your Phoenix Flame, right? So that's pretty cool. Then the other part of this is obviously paying for what we want to do. Now, this is where the Rupture line becomes a little more restrictive because you want 0 blues for your Kodachis, right? It doesn't have to be a blue for your Kodachis, but it has to be a 0, but then you want that blue for probably what you want to do after that, right? So the Rupture line is really looking for 0 blues. Now, the nice thing there is they don't necessarily have to be Draconic cards, as I'm showing here, but for the most part, they probably will be, with the exception of, like you could run 100 wins and stuff like that for sure. So not a bad deal there. But again, remember, you have to have, in most cases, you're going to want to get a 0 blue in order to make the Rupture line work. And, if you are playing you don't have to use Emberblade, right? But if you are playing Emberblade, you also want to have a blue. It does not have to be a 0 in that case. That said, as I've been playing around a lot more with the Draconic line, Emberblade's not as key. I think a lot of us suspected that from the beginning, that Emberblade wasn't necessarily super critical, but then we started to see the power of it just being reliable and on the table. But remember, and I agree, I do think you want it. I do think you want to play it in the Draconic line. That said, it doesn't destroy your turn if you don't use it. So the point of that is the Draconic can get away without using a blue, right? Which that's part of why I'm coming around to the not really flexibility, but less restrictiveness of the Draconic line. And then lastly, we have our chain enders, right? This is your big hit at the end. Mostly this applies to your Rupture line, but there's a Rise Up, for example. That's a chain ender that has Rupture, but it's a Rupture that you're probably mostly going to play with your Draconic line, right? Because you want to have, if you want to maximize that sucker, you're going to have flames out, which is going to be a lot harder to do with the Rupture line. And now let's go into kind of where I'm coming at from the stat side of this, right? The number side of this. So what I'm showing up right now is actually an excerpt from my engineering textbook. Now, just roll with me on this one, right? So what's considered to be a rare event in the process control world is when something happens less than 1% of the time. That's considered to be a rare event. So some examples you see down there below, right? If you were to flip a coin, right? Flipping a coin and getting heads 3 times in a row is not considered to be a rare event, but if you were to do that 8 times in a row, that would be considered to be a rare event. So where we're applying that to, or where I'm trying to apply that to the deck makeup and the ratios is, how many of what card do I need to have to statistically be at the point where I can really get what I need when I want it the majority of the time. Now, what I'm putting up right here are just some pure quick. Now, for the stats nerds, I don't have frequency in these calculations, but they're very, very, very close to where they would be, right, without that anyway. And what I mean by frequency is, right, I'm only looking at the first draw here, right? But if we go back and we look at the rare event less than 1%, what we see is that 40% or 40 cards out of a 60 card deck would need to be a target card, right? So if I wanted to draw a blue 0, I'd have to have 40 blue 0s. Obviously, unless like your Guardian trying to draw a blue card or something, that's not going to be a very successful model in Flesh and Blood, because you're not going to be able to put out the damage that you want, right? So if we really go back and look at, probability for a rare event at less than 5%, right? So saying basically 95% of the time we're going to get what we want. Becomes a little more manageable at 31. Now that's still too high, right, for Flesh and Blood to be practical, right? So those are the actual realistic numbers that I've been using to kind of guide us along, but of course they're not really practical. So if we go into like a realistic, more practical number, if we go look at like a traditional Katsu Kodachi build, there's been many lists over the years that have done quite well. Most of them run somewhere in like the 18 to 20 range, right? So if we look at 20 target cards, meaning like in this case there'd be 20 Firestarters or 20 blue zeros, we have a probability of drawing that at 0.81, right? So it's about 81% of the time, right? And if you actually then go through and remember that, hey, right, if we have Snapdragons, we have the Tide Flippers, we have ways to get Go Again, you can actually dial that number back just a little, because it basically gives you a free turn to miss. So that's why my target that I've been trying to use is right around 75% or so, right? Because if you look at that, so in this case, we have the probability of not drawing it at 0.23. If you square that, that's 0.05, so that's right around the 5% margin of allowance that we were talking about, right? So a lot of words there basically to say what you really want to be able to guarantee that the majority of your time, or the ability that you're probably only going to miss once per game, is around 18 of those target cards. And again, this is just on your initial draw. So if you're too worried about that, sure, you have your pseudo mulligan, right? Kind of, if you go second, but you also have a way out, like your flippers, your scalers, or something like that, right? So again, that's why we need to apply the real numbers, or the mathematical, theoretical numbers. We need to apply them realistically. So that's kind of where I've decided is that, your target cards, to make it work, it has to be right around 18 or so. Now, if we go in and we apply these numbers that we just talked about to Rupture, specifically, Rupture has a problem. Not really a problem, but it has two conditions, right? So you need a 0 to pitch to get your Go Again, likely a blue 0, but you also need an ender, right? You need some reason to actually use that blue 0, right? Aside from just Kodachi, because that's not going to win you a game, right? It's actually going to lose you a game if you're only coming in at 1 per turn, or 2 1s per turn, but you get it, right? Your opponent's going to take it and they're going to clap back for 8. That's not how you win, right? So you need 2 of those, which means that basically your stats compound there, right? Because you have to draw a blue 0 and you have to draw a ender or a Rupture card or whatever it may be. So going through just various iterations on that, but you can't obviously, like if you wanted to, going back to the 1% thing or the 5% thing, like 31 and 31, already you're capped, right? So you can't get both, right? And then yes, there's a combination piece there, right? And that's again where the stats guys are coming in here. It's like, well, if you look at the percentage of drawing that and percentage of drawing that, you can't just simply multiply because you also have the combination you need to subtract. So it's not super clean, but basically what it comes down to is I believe you need about 18 blues, you need about 20 enders that are either Rupture or otherwise, and then you need about 20 zero-cost mid-chainers. Now, the exception here being that you could still have a ender, quote-unquote, that is not, that has Go Again, right? That could also serve as a mid-chain or something like that. Generally, though, you're going to want it to have an on-hit. Most of the on-hit stuff doesn't naturally have Go Again. But the other portion of this, and now remember the Ruptures, though, they need that third card, right? They need the mid-chain one. But if you're going to run some of the other stuff that just has on hits, they might not necessarily, right? More of like a traditional ninja build or something like that. They may not necessarily need the mid-chain. And then you also have, that kind of overlap. Like if you were to run 100 Winds, for example, 100 Winds is a mid and a combo, or it's a mid and an ender in of itself, right? So you get a little bit of overlap, and then you throw in your ancestrals and so on like that to kind of round out your deck. But I do think that the 18 blues for the Kodachi Rupture version is kind of about where you need to be, right? 18 plus. I don't know that I would go much lower than 18. There's obviously some Katsu people out there who may disagree with that, but I think by and large, if you go much lower than 18, you're going to have chances of not getting what you need. If we pop over to the Draconic line, we look at the conditions that are needed there, and you need a Firestarter, right? We need something that can play with Go Again, preferably a red card, and it needs to be non-conditional Go Again, right? It doesn't need anything played before it, so it has to be a Firestarter. You You have to be able to, this deck can survive without pitch, right? It could, in theory, have a whole bunch of zeros, right? You'd prefer to have a blue, but it could go without zeros. And again, we don't necessarily need our weapon. It's going to help us if we do have that blue pitch, because we're also probably going to have a 1 somewhere along the line, but we can survive. So not every hand in this is going to be a bomb, right? Not every hand's going to go for 8 or 9 links, but more hands will ultimately be playable, because if we compare this build or the requirements on this versus, so if you compare the requirements on the ideal turn here for Draconic, it is more restrictive than the Rupture line, but because this one can operate, I believe, at a higher level than the Rupture line, I think this one actually ends up being more consistent, right? Because again, Rupture, you needed to have 2 pieces to really have an effective hand. Here, you can have a pseudo-effective hand with really just 1 piece, right? So when you start comparing the chances of consistently drawing what you need to be happy, believe it or not, I believe the Draconic line actually wins here, right? So if you go to the Draconic line looking at makeup, right, the Firestarters are often R0, but they can also double as a mid-chain, right? I talked about that earlier with, the Ronin Renegade, right? Just a 0-3. I mean, if it has go again, it can still play mid-chain, right? So you can go a lot heavier into those because it just makes sense because they serve dual purpose. So in this case, I think you only need 15 blues, and that's, again, if you're planning on heavily using the weapon. If you don't care about using the weapon, then you could even go potentially less, right? I do think that having that weapon there is going to help you out a lot, so that's where I'm right now with still trying to swing the weapon from time to time. But you could go lower if you were just basically going YOLO. I do think you need 20 plus Firestarters, and the majority of those need to be red, right? And that's the other reason that I think you need 15 plus blues, and you cannot double dip there, right? So if you have a Firestarter, right, within that additional 20% margin, you want to make sure that not too many of your Firestarters are blues, because then you're eating each other there, right, in terms of your pool. You fill it out with your mid-chainers, right? Your whatever you want it to be, your mid-chains, and then you're going to have your Art of Wars, your Ancestrals, and such like that. So that's where I think the ratios lie. Again, if your personal play style, you think you just want to kind of YOLO it a little bit and not worry about the weapon, sure, you could go less on the blues and then maybe go heavier on the red Firestarters. But like I said, I think about 80% of that 20 plus needs to be red, because so many of your mid-chain stuff that give you the benefits, pop the flames back, you get it. They all depend on having a red card having been played. Well, the majority of them depend on having a red card having been played. So that's basically the conclusion. I know it was kind of weird to get there, but I kind of really wanted to explain the logic on why I was tossing out the specific numbers that I was. So, like I said, on the surface, when I went into this, I was really thinking that the Rupture line was going to be a lot easier to do repeatedly. That said, with the fact that you have to draw 2, or you have 2 conditions to meet, a lot of times I think it's actually going to be easier, or is going, and we'll see at the competitive level. We will see once we actually start jamming these into real players who have reps. But I think the Draconic line, even though it's more explosive, generally you equate explosivity as a trade-off with reliability. But in this case, I think it actually can do both. So right now, I think that's probably going to end up being the superior line. But we will see. There's the numbers, and then there's how the game actually plays. So we will see how that all turns out. Let me know what you guys think. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Which one are you preferring? How do my numbers look versus what you've actually been playing, right? Because again, there's math, and then there's actually getting it on the table. So anyway, folks, thank you for joining. I want to give a huge shout out to Gongai Games. We got tournaments coming up, release weekend this week, right? We had pre-release 2 weeks ago, release weekends this weekend. Super excited, gonna get that. Have a Blitz tournament this weekend. We will see you there, hopefully. And don't forget Travis over at Fab Foundry for all those singles that you don't pull out of your packs. I hope you get everything you need. But when you don't, look at Travis Fab Foundry. Use the link below. And I get a small kickback from that, and it is much appreciated. So anyway, folks, thanks for tuning in. Let me know what you think about today's cast. If nothing else, go Commando.